In The Stars Down to Earth, Theodor Adorno sets out to analyse the astrology column and astrology itself from a sociological perspective. Astrology at first glance seems like an odd topic for a philosopher who was chiefly concerned with the pathological nature of American capitalism, Stalinist Russia, and Nazi Germany. However, astrology connects with Adorno's philosophical project in a myriad of ways. Dialectic of Enlightenment is a book which Adorno co-wrote with Max Horkheimer and published in 1947, 10 years before this essay was published. The main argument of the book is that irrationality, exemplified by mythology, for example in Homer's Odyssey, contains a kernel of rationality in the form of humanity using reason to subjugate nature. However, rationality can also become irrational, as the forces humanity used to subjugate nature undergo a dialectical reversal and begin to subjugate humanity itself, which culminates in the development of the culture industry, where industrial society curbs human autonomy through mass entertainment in the forms of radio, television, and film. This framing of a dialectical relationship between irrationality and rationality in Dialectic of Enlightenment also appears in Adorno's essay on astrology, in which he writes, with regard to totalitarian movements, "It would be a mistake, however, to call such mass phenomena entirely irrational, to regard them as completely disconnected from individual and collective ego aims. In fact, most of them are based on an exaggeration and distortion of such ego aims, rather than on their neglect. They function as though rationality of the self-maintaining body politic had grown malignant, and therewith threatened to destroy the organism." Astrology, for Adorno, is equally a form of irrationality, or more strictly speaking, superstition, which holds a kernel of rationality in the purpose it serves for both its subjects and the self-maintaining body politic. What's important to note in this passage is that Adorno highlights that people seem to act against their own rational interest of self-preservation, but that it cannot be considered irrational because the behavior of people is rational within the logic of their ego aims. Following Freud's theory of the pleasure principle, the psyche is generally driven by the desire to seek out pleasures and avoid pain. This is what astrology within the logic of ego aims achieves, according to Adorno. It is important that the readers of astrology columns participate in them largely through the mediation of magazines and newspapers, the personal advice of professional astrologers being too expensive. The fact that the columns are addressed from a single point to a broad audience has a formal effect, since the columns must be able to apply to everyone, whereas in a one-to-one meeting with an astrologer, a more personal and specific relationship would ensue. Adorno draws a parallel between the primary-secondary group distinction and primary-secondary superstition. From the Oxford Dictionary of Media and Communication, a primary group is a small group based largely on long-term face-to-face interaction and typically based on affiliation, such as a family or a friendship group. A secondary group is one based on shared goals or interests, in which the members are rarely, if ever, in face-to-face contact with each other. Therefore, primary superstition would be a face-to-face relationship between tarot card readers, fortune tellers, professional astrologers, etc., whereas secondary superstition includes all the superstitious activities where the participants are not co-present. This normally takes the form of mass media, a centralized point of distribution, newspapers, television, film, etc., which is then consumed by many people who have a one-way relationship to the media source. The points of consumption and production are kept at a distance. Whereas, in tarot card reading, both production and consumption take place in the same room. Adorno writes, "They don't even see the sorcerers at work anymore, nor are they allowed to listen to their abracadabra. They simply get the dope." Adorno goes on, "Like psychiatry, symphony concerts, or political parties, they accept it because it exists, without much reflection, provided only that their own psychological demands somehow correspond to the offer. They are hardly interested in the justification of the system." This highlights the fact that there is no need to fall into intentional fallacy. The fact that people are already doing it is evidence enough that astrology serves some sort of function. If you ask why people like it, they would usually answer something like, it's just a bit of fun and it's just meaningless. Yet psychologically, this cannot suffice for an explanation because nothing comes from nothing. As Freud emphasizes, all our behaviors are in some form linked to our ego drives and desire to reach libidinal homeostasis. Adorno makes a historical point regarding astrology. The sharp division between alchemy and chemistry, between astrology and astronomy, is a comparatively late achievement. Today, however, the incompatibility of the progress of natural sciences, such as astrophysics, with a belief in astrology is blatant. Those who combine both are forced to an intellectual retrogression, which formerly was hardly required. This clearly highlights one element. A contemporaneous belief in astrology differs from those who believed in astrology in medieval times. In medieval times, astrology was not only interweaved with astronomy, as Adorno explains, but was also a key element of study for medical students. The zodiac man is an image which can be seen in hundreds of manuscripts for medical students in the medieval times. The position of celestial bodies would be used, for example, to predict the best time for a surgical operation to be performed. A medieval person, therefore, would engage in astrology within the context of what they believe to be a scientific practice, whereas a contemporary person engaging in astrology is engaging with it in spite of the fact that it has long been purged from all reputable scientific communities. So, as Adorno states, an intellectual retrogression on the behalf of participants is now necessary when engaging in astrology, as participants must on some level, perhaps unconsciously, dismiss the fact that scientific developments have debunked astrology in order to enjoy it, whereas in medieval times this dismissal was not required, since it essentially was science. This is also a clue to the fact that very strong instinctual demands must be at work, which is to say, there must be a strong psychological incentive for people to subject themselves to astrology, despite the fact it has been widely dismissed as pseudoscientific. Adorno goes on, in view of the interweaving of rational and irrational elements, we are mainly interested in the direct or indirect messages conveyed by the material to its consumers. Such messages combine irrationally, inasmuch as they aim at blind acceptance and presuppose unconscious anger in the consumers, and rationality, inasmuch as they deal with more or less practical everyday problems for which they pretend to offer the most helpful answer. Adorno notes that there is a strange juxtaposition of the rational and irrational nature of the astrology columns. They are irrational in the sense that they presume the reader will happily follow the supplied guidance with blind faith, as well as the fact the reader must presume that the author of the astrology column has access to transcendent knowledge which is inaccessible to the reader. They are rational, in Adorno's words, inasmuch as they deal with more or less practical everyday problems for which they pretend to have the most helpful answer. Now, before we proceed with Adorno's analysis, it will be necessary to address the fact that the astrology columns Adorno wrote about are over half a century old now. The horoscopes Adorno sources are from the Los Angeles Times from November 1952 to February 1953. However, having consulted a variety of internet horoscope sites, columns in popular newspapers, and the like, it is somewhat shocking how much the material addressed by Adorno 70 years ago barely differs to the astrological content which is published today. The quarter moon in Gemini turns your social charm into a superpower, reads one such example, with a standard flattery attempt attributing the reader with social charm. The main departure from the content Adorno treats is the absence of the AM-PM structure and variance in whether astrological niceties are included or omitted. By astrological niceties, we refer to technical references to the movement and alignment of the planets, for example, with Mars aligning with Neptune, etc. Elle magazine and the British tabloid Metro include technical astrological references such as a potent lunar phase clashes with Mars in Leo. However, the New York Post and Daily Express drop any technical language and stick to general advice, which Adorno notes is barely discernible from pop psychology or advice columns. Step into the spotlight and let people see what you are capable of. The next section of the essay will elaborate on the structure of the column, where it will become clear how similar contemporary columns are to the ones Adorno pored over. Adorno reflects on the basic structure of the column, remarking that astrological niceties and astrological lingo, except for the popular 12 signs of the zodiac, are absent. The more sinister aspects of astrology, such as emphasis on catastrophes and threatening doom, hardly make themselves felt. Everything sounds respectable, sedate, and sensible, and astrology as such is treated as something established and socially recognized, an uncontroversial element of our culture, as though it was somewhat bashful of its own shadiness. This trend of defanging spiritual movements of their more radical or controversial elements, such as predictions of apocalypse, can be seen throughout society. One can consider the way that Western Buddhism is marketed not necessarily as a means of escaping the cycle of samsara and reaching nirvana, but merely as a means of self-help, or even, as Slavoj Žižek has remarked, as a way for financial traders to emotionally detach from their actions in order to make trades more efficiently. However, perhaps this is simply a way of rendering astrology as more palatable and easier for readers to identify with. Adorno notes that people in a highly organized and institutionalized society are faced with antagonism and absurdities, such as the threat technology poses to everyone, despite the fact technological progress is intended to make our lives easier. World War II catalyzed a technological advancement which ushered in both time-saving consumer goods and nuclear bombs. Adorno's general thesis here is that, in the face of daily life being governed by an opaque and inscrutable system, industrial capitalism, we attempted to accept such absurdities like the verdict of the stars, rather than penetrate them by thinking, which means discomfort in many directions. He explains that the social system is the fate of most individuals, independent of their will and interest, and that it is projected upon the stars in order thus to obtain a higher degree of dignity and justification in which the individuals hope to participate themselves. Adorno continues, thus, the discrepancy between the rational and the irrational aspects of the column is expressive of a tension inherent in social reality itself. To be rational means not questioning irrational conditions, but to make the best of them from the viewpoint of one's private interests. Essentially, Adorno's point here is that the astrology column is a system where one is subjected to irrational forces, the merciless stars, and yet the rule is not to question the wisdom of the column, but to make the best of them from the viewpoint of one's interest, which Adorno says expresses the tension inherent in social reality itself. The tension in social reality refers to the fact that we are often told just to keep our head down and work hard, with the promise that we will all be rewarded, which is at odds with the fact that we are all simultaneously aware that our lives are shaped by forces outside of our control, and which are often out of control even of the elites in society, forces such as technological change and economic crises. The astrology column therefore acclimatizes the reader to the notion that impersonal forces can be mitigated by simply following the demands of an authority figure, in this case represented by the stargazer. In the next chapter, Adorno compares the astrology columns in newspapers, such as the Los Angeles Times, to the specialized astrological magazines, such as Forecast, Astrology Guide, American Astrology, World Astrology, True Astrology, and Everyday Astrology. He notes that the primary difference is that the astrology magazines tend to include more astrological material, whereas the newspaper columns remain more down-to-earth. Adorno says, astrology undertakes the constant encouragement of people to take decisions, no matter how inconsequential they may be. This statement connects to two of Adorno's concepts, pseudoactivity and actionism. In his essay Free Time, Adorno describes pseudoactivity as misguided spontaneity, where people are distracted by spurious and illusory activities, by institutionalized vicarious satisfactions, than to face up to the awareness of how little access they have to the possibility of change today. For Adorno, the astrology horoscope commands readers to engage in such pseudo-activities, providing them the libidinal satisfaction of feeling like something of substance has been pursued, when in reality the true antagonisms in the reader's life remain untouched, but they are now free to continue to participate in capitalist society with a sense that they are in control. To quote Adorno, the empty shell of liberty is solicitously kept intact. Adorno goes on, the semi-erudite vaguely wants to understand and is also driven by the narcissistic wish to prove superior to the plain people, but he is not in a position to carry through complicated and detached intellectual operations. This comment, which is remarking on the nature of astrological magazines as opposed to the Los Angeles Times column, shines a light on the nature of astrology within the publications which specialize in it. Adorno conjures up the image of a semi-erudite person, someone who has been educated to a fair degree, perhaps out of the necessity to be an efficient worker in industrial society, and so is knowledgeable enough to be aware of the precarity and anxiety of living in industrial society, but however lacks the full array of skills and knowledge in order to carry through complicated and detached intellectual operations, and sufficiently understand the cause of this predicament. Astrology, however, can stand in for this lack through providing a shortcut by bringing the complex to a handy formula and offering at the same time pleasant gratification. Elsewhere in this essay, we see Adorno linking astrology to the mentality of the high scorers of the authoritarian personality. The Authoritarian Personality is a book published in 1950. Adorno and a team of social scientists applied both empirical and theoretical methods to research what psychological characteristics render a person vulnerable to submitting to and advocating for authoritarian political figures. The parallels between the authoritarian personality and astrology include demand for blind submission to an authority, fascist leaders for authoritarianism and the majors for astrology, externalization of individual problems, the anti-Semitic externalization of problems onto the figure of the Jew in authoritarianism, the externalization of events onto the movements of the planets and stars in astrology. Both of these tendencies can also be seen in contemporary conspiracy theories, where the inherent complexity of society is shunned. Instead, simple scapegoating of powerful shadowy figures is used to explain historical events and social tensions. Regarding the psychological effects of the astrological column, Adorno identifies a certain paradox. The reader is looking for specific advice and guidance to help them in their life, and yet the columnist has no possibility of knowing the specific concerns of each individual. And even if they did, the column has to be able to address everyone generally. Yet the stargazer has to provide unequivocal answers to assert their celestial and transcendent knowledge, while at the same time, the advice has to be vague enough to maintain credibility. The solution to this is the deployment of what Adorno refers to as pseudo-individuality. The astrology column writer uses rigid stereotypes of style, saying, "Follow that intuition of yours." Adorno notes that these references to individual characteristics are so vague that they could apply to everyone. However, he also notes that they have a flattering effect in attributing good traits to the reader. Therefore, despite the paradox, the pseudo-individualization, or the facade of presenting something as though it was specific when it's really general, resolves the paradox of the column. But this is not the only trick that the columnist has to rely on. There is also the habit equally well known to serious psychiatrists and to popular psychologists. Adorno notes that narcissistic gratifications are made in order to make up for the fact that the columnist can't possibly know anyone's individual situation or the details of their troubles. And if it's true that people who have any affinity at all to occultism are usually prepared to react to the information they are craving in such a way as to make it fit their own system at almost any cost, then flattery can effectively paper over the logical inconsistencies which may make the readers doubt the power of the magus. Display that keen mind of yours is an example of such flattery. Adorno then explains that anxiety is also a key theme and tool of the column. The idea that the reader is somehow threatened must be maintained, because only if some mild terror is exercised he will seek help, analogous to advertising of drugs against body odour. Thereby the column generates its own necessity. It becomes the means through which readers can evade threats the column itself conjures up. One of the threats posed to the reader by the column is that of traffic accidents. Adorno dryly remarks that traffic accidents are an ever-present danger in the congested Los Angeles area, but he also highlights that a traffic accident is an external threat, and therefore does not compromise the reader's narcissism. Again, we must note the contradiction between the rational and irrational. The stars are invoked in order to reinforce the harmless, beneficial but trivial admonition, drive carefully. To take the column's advice seriously is to be invested in the irrational idea that we, or the magus, can divine information from the position of celestial bodies, and yet this irrational epistemology results in only the most rational and mundane advice. Drive carefully. Adorno then proceeds to highlight what he believes to be the most important construct of the column, dependence. He views the readers of the column as beset psychologically by what has come to be known as ego weakness, but is often expressive of weakness in reality. The astrology columnist then knows he must provide narcissistic defenses for those suffering from ego weakness, or what is popularly referred to as an inferiority complex. Adorno views this relationship between the reader and the column as a somewhat self-fulfilling prophecy. He writes that compulsive systems are employed as defense without ever involving any behavior that might change the basic situation of dependence. So the issue is not necessarily that the astrological column is irrational, but rather that the solutions it offers are only pseudo-solutions which perpetuate the reader's position of dependence on the column itself. The tendency of the column to provide pseudo-solutions for the reader's situation is also reflected in how Adorno explains that the column implies that whoever is aware of these situations will somehow be taken care of. Then he proceeds, "There is a soothing overtone to the whole column. It seems to reassure the reader incessantly that everything will be fine, overcoming his apprehensions by establishing some magical confidence in the good turn of events." Adorno compares the happy ending of the column with the same phenomenon in mass media. Soap operas, television shows, and above all movies are characterized by heroes, persons who positively or negatively solve their own problems. They stand vicariously for the spectator. By identifying himself with the hero, he believes to participate in the very power that is denied him as much as he conceives himself as weak and dependent. However, instead of identifying with the hero, like in a superhero film, the reader of the column instead must be confident in the stars, which promises to solve their problems automatically, but this is contingent upon behaving in accordance with the standards set by the column, which we will go into deeper later. Adorno states that life actually does not automatically take care of people, and therefore what the column is actually promoting is no more than social conformity and generally justifying the status quo. In the next short section, Adorno summarizes the image of the addressee constructed by the astrology columnist. Although the readers of the column are presumed to be predominantly female, the image constructed is generally that of a stereotypical man of the period. Adorno writes, "The reader is presented as a professional person who has authority and has to make decisions. He is presented as a practical person, technically minded and able to fix things." Adorno's point here is of course not a chauvinist one. He is not saying that authority ought to be the domain of men. Rather, his point that the current condition of women in the 1950s in the United States is that they are primarily dependent and this column perpetuates this dependence by giving them the false sense that they are in control. Adorno then notes that the socio-economic position assumed by the column is that of the vice president, someone who frequently needs to make important decisions and yet is not at the top of the ladder. The way Adorno describes the reader of the column is somewhat reminiscent of Gregory Bateson's theory of a double bind. The column gives the reader the impression that they are a big shot, that they are in the position to make decisions and take control of their life. However, if the reader were truly in such a position, it would render the astrological column unnecessary. The reader would be capable of overcoming their situation autonomously. So all the column provides is what Adorno refers to as pseudoactivity. Actions which are enough to feel as if something is being done, and yet renders the situation exactly the same as it were before, and furthermore, actually perpetuates the social situation. Continuous advice is given to take some action, to behave like a successful go-getter. What is thus emphasized is not so much the addressee's real ego power as his intellectual identification with some socialized ego ideal. Here are some examples of pseudo-actions suggested by the column. Adorno goes on in the next section to note the temporal structuring of the column, which he notes is biphasic. Biphasic simply means something which is split into two phases. Often the horoscopes give advice on what to do in the AM or PM. Adorno notes that the AM activities are generally work-related, which is in line with structuring the reader's reality principle, in opposition to the pleasure principle. The reality principle refers to Freud's theory of the psyche, where the ego forgoes immediately pleasurable activities for the sake of attending to practical matters, what is commonly referred to as delayed gratification. The PM, on the other hand, or the evening, is the realm of the pleasure principle. Consumerist and leisure activities are earmarked to be pursued within these times. Adorno writes, "Pleasure thus becomes the award of work, work the atonement for pleasure." In order to frame how this AM-PM structure serves and reinforces ego weakness, Adorno quotes a passage from Erich Fromm's The Feeling of Impotence. Faith in time lacks the sense of sudden change. It substitutes expectations that, in due time, everything will come out all right. Conflicts, which one feels unable to resolve oneself, are expected to be resolved by time, without one's having to take the risk of deciding. Faith in time is found especially frequently with respect to one's own achievements. People not only console themselves over their unperformed performances, but also over not preparing for the performance by persuading themselves that they have left so much time and that there is no reason to hurry. An example of this mechanism is the case of a greatly gifted author who wanted to write a book which, in his opinion, would rank among the most important of world literature. All he did was to pursue a series of thoughts about it, to indulge in fantasies about the epoch-making effect his book would produce, and to tell his friend that it was almost finished. Actually, although he had worked on the book for 7 years, he had not yet written a single line. As these people get older, they must cling even more stubbornly to the illusion that time will take care of things. Many, when they reach a certain age, usually the early 40s, either sober up and abandon the illusion and make efforts to utilize their own powers, or have a neurotic breakdown because life without the consoling illusion of time as a benefactor becomes intolerable. Adorno relates this quotation from Erich Fromm to the way children tend to imagine what they will do when they grow up, noting that it is sensible for children to enjoy considering what they will become in the future, given that they have not yet fully developed their mental capacities and don't yet have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. But when adults exhibit this growing up fantasy, it becomes neurotic. Of course, it's not that adults are literally imagining they will grow up and become an astronaut in the future. The parallel to be drawn is that both children and adults enjoy the potential for their lives to develop in the future. However, for adults, this fantasy takes on the function of shifting their responsibility to an abstract time factor which absolves them of their failures. It is easy to misunderstand Adorno and see him as pathologizing this type of behavior and blaming individuals. After all, he regards a weak ego to be one of the causes of this pattern of behavior. However, he does also recognize this childish fantasizing as a result of people being objectively incapable of molding their own fate. Objectively here likely refers to the fact that economic and social constraints mean that individuals aren't practically able to take matter into their own hands. This theme constantly reappears throughout the essay. It is not that astrology's appeal is without an objective character. It is not that the appeal of astrology corresponds to some sort of innate gullibility. It is rather that the appeal of astrology corresponds to the demand of the reader's ego within the economic paradigm which confronts the reader as an external force. Adorno begins the next section, which is called Work and Pleasure, by quoting an English rhyme which children in Germany are taught. Work while you work, play while you play. This is the way to be cheerful and gay. Adorno then notes that the separation of work and pleasure maps onto the structure of society, where individuals have two sections to exist in, one where he functions as a producer and one where he functions as a consumer. Adorno regards this notion to be advantageous in terms of economic rationalization, meaning it helps individuals conform to what is demanded of them economically. But he then goes on to critique the intrinsic merits of separating work and pleasure. Adorno says, "Work completely severed from the element of playfulness becomes drab and monotonous, a tendency which is consummated by the complete quantification of industrial work. Pleasure, when equally isolated from the serious content of life, becomes silly, meaningless, and sheer entertainment. And ultimately, it is a mere means of reproducing one's working capacity, where the real substance of any non-utilitarian activity lies in the way it faces and sublimates reality. To be serious is the greatest joy." Here, Adorno, a true dialectician, refuses to take a binary view. Commonplace views of work and pleasure under capitalism argue that work is mere drudgery, and the pursuit of pleasurable leisure activities is the ideal of life. However, as capitalism forces us to sell our labour in order to be able to buy cinema tickets, go on holiday, eat fine foods, etc., pleasure is relegated to merely being an instrument to incentivize work. A contrary commonplace view is that work is where virtue lies, but capitalism tempts us to indulge in the pleasures of consumerism, frivolous activities like shopping and watching television, as opposed to engaging in productive work, a type of Protestant rejection of consumerism. Adorno refuses to condemn either work or pleasure in themselves, but rather sees the virtue in both, and recognizes the distortion which both work and pleasure undergo in capitalism. The strict bifurcation of work from pleasure and pleasure from work is literally written into the individual's employment contract in the form of working hours. Adorno writes, "It is one of the major tenets of the column, possibly the most important of all, that pleasure itself is permissible only if it serves ultimately some ulterior purpose of success and self-promotion. This claim brings to mind the compulsion to document which exists in the digital era. An experience, dining at a restaurant, a house party, a holiday, etc., is not enough in itself, but must be photographed or filmed for the sake of posting on social media, as social media platforms themselves can serve as a means of boosting one's social media account and augmenting one's social capital. We should consider the role of pleasure in Adorno's own work. Although the stereotype of Adorno is that of a dry, joyless academic, we see here that he advocates for playfulness in a sense. Furthermore, Adorno's own scholarly work can be seen as including an element of playfulness. Adorno frequently applies the poetic technique of chiasmus in his writing, sometimes to a comical effect. Chiasmus can be thought of as a mirroring or inverting of terms for dramatic effect. For example, in Adorno's Minima Moralia, whose title itself is an inversion of Aristotle's Magna Moralia, Adorno describes his work as the melancholy science, which is an inversion of Nietzsche's gay or happy science. He also names a chapter The Health Unto Death, which is an inversion of Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. It is easy to overlook this wordplay as merely a quirk or an eccentricity, but it does indicate that Adorno believes that even within the most serious work there is a need for playfulness. To play with language is to refuse a purely utilitarian approach to one's work, to refuse to reduce a text to mere instrumental reason. Interestingly, Adorno remarks upon the theme of gadgetering within the astrology column. Although technology seems to be antithetical to astrology, as one belongs in the realm of science and the other in the realm of spirituality, the imperative to purchase gadgets appears in the column. Make more happiness there, your home, by more interesting gadgets. The excess productive capacity created by the expansion of arms manufacturing throughout World War II led to increased consumer spending, with credit widely being taken up as a means to buy consumer goods. Many of these consumer goods included household gadgets such as televisions and refrigerators, so it makes sense that purchasing gadgets would be encouraged by a newspaper which profited through advertising those very same goods. Adorno says that people adapt themselves to modern technology by making it, as it were, their own cause, and that it seems that the kind of retrogression highly characteristic of persons who do not any longer feel that they are self-determining subjects of their fate is concomitant with a fetishistic attitude towards the very same conditions which tend to be dehumanizing them. To draw a modern parallel, this is reminiscent of the phenomenon Kyle Chaker refers to called algorithmic anxiety in his book Filter World. Chaker writes, "Algorithmic anxiety describes the burgeoning awareness that we must constantly contend with automated technological processes beyond our understanding and control, whether in our Facebook feeds, Google Maps driving directions, or Amazon product promotions." Algorithmic anxiety can be seen as a microcosm of the invisible market forces we are subjected to under capitalism. Adorno sees that individuals who are less and less able to control their own fate, where the whims of demand and supply determine whether they will remain employed or be able to afford food and rent next week, necessarily conjure up a superstitious attitude in order to assuage this anxiety. Similarly, social media algorithms are forms of artificial attention markets, where engagement metrics are a stand-in for exchange value. The increase of the former, of course, often leads to an increase in the latter. Users of social media platforms similarly conjure up superstitions in order to deal with the invisible hand of the algorithm. Kyle Chaker writes, "Where hosts worry about Airbnb's search algorithm, artists similarly fret about Instagrams and musicians about Spotify's. The host's reaction to such algorithmic anxiety, the researchers found, was to develop folk theories, superstitious tricks that were meant to goose more algorithmic promotion and better search results, the same way I used to post my article links with fake wedding announcements." Superstition is ironically prevalent in times where technological domination is at its most intense. In the next section, titled Adjustment and Individuality, Adorno proceeds to consider the role of the individual and society and how this pertains to the astrology column. He considers that the biphasic organization of work and pleasure is analogous to the system of bureaucracy in Max Weber's understanding. That is, both bureaucracy for Max Weber and the astrology column for Adorno can be considered to be a rational or instrumental manner of organizing human activity into a form which allows the current social system to maintain itself. The comparison of fields as disparate as bureaucracy and astrology seems profoundly odd, but in a certain sense they can both be seen as providing individuals with a system of rules to adhere to in order to go along with society. Weber and Adorno are also both concerned with the role of the individual in such a society. Adorno notes, "The classical liberal ideas of unlimited individual activity, freedom, and ruggedness are incompatible with the present developmental phase in which the individual is more and more required to obey strict organizational demands made by society. Therefore, the astrology column finds itself in a contradiction, where it must somehow support the idea of an autonomous free individual, and yet present this to the reader in a form which encourages conformity to the strict organizational demands made by society. Adorno explains that the column manages to do this thusly. Individuality itself is submerged in the process of transformation of ends into means. The reader is incessantly encouraged to impress others with his individuality by making use of those assets which seem to be so highly coveted that everybody is prepared to attribute them to himself if he is given the chance to do so. So the column emphasizes that an individuality has to be subordinated to the role of a means rather than an end. Individuality is no longer seen as a virtue in itself, as a marker of free expression or a free society, but rather an asset that can be marketed as though it were what in business jargon is referred to as a USP, or unique selling point, of a human being rather than a commodity. By now, it has become clear that a frequent theme in Adorno's analysis is ambivalence, the cold, calculating, technical rationality of industrial capitalism versus the superstitious and mythical irrationality of astrology. The manner in which the act of reading the column is simultaneously an act of submission, of giving oneself up to the magus, and yet appeals to a sense of narcissism and individuality. This theme continues into the section of the essay titled Ruggedness and Dependence. Adorno writes, "Thus the column's task is twofold. Inasmuch as the situation makes for subordination, it has to reassure its readers that they are nevertheless rugged individuals. Readers are also encouraged to talk things over with others, which Adorno interprets as a sign that many people have the conviction that others know more about them than themselves. This conviction is in turn a symptom of the fact that, as Adorno writes, whoever is subject to cold, dehumanized, rigid, and alienated social relationships feels insufficiently understood." This brings to mind Marx's famous remark regarding capitalism creating material relations between persons and social relations between things. As the objective realm of material production begins to dominate social relations, the subjective realm suffers, and in a sense the astrology column is part of a commodity in the form of the newspaper, which is performing a social role for the reader within a material exchange. Adorno notes that the column tends to transform objective problems into subjective and psychological ones. Adorno writes, "If it is envisaged that the addressee is being hurt by someone, he is made to understand that he is not to hit back, but rather to assume an attitude indicative of his own inner superiority and to yield. The psychiatrically well-known pattern of identification with the aggressor seems to be one of the column's basic positive ideas on human relationships. Perhaps it can be seen nowhere more clearly than here how the column, and the popular psychology to which it is related, strengthens defenses rather than dissolves them. Human relationships are viewed in an authoritarian way, organized according to an implicit hierarchy of the strong and the weak, and accordingly almost entirely on the ruggedness versus dependence level." In the next section of the essay, Adorno considers the various categories of human relationships as mentioned in the column, beginning with family and neighbors, then friends, experts, and higher-ups. Adorno states that, in the column, the family generally appears either as a resource of help or as a source of complaints and demands which one has to satisfy to a certain extent in order to have a tolerable life. With the biphasic structure separating daily life into AM, work time, i.e. production, and PM, i.e. leisure time and consumption, the family is located in the leisure time section. References to the family take on a kind of bureaucratic or instrumental tone, where conflict simply serves as an opportunity. Unsatisfactory family, property matter brings you big chance to show your ability to handle personal relations diplomatically, conscientiously. In PM, plan budget. Advice is doled out to the addressee as if they were a high-level executive mediating between parties in a business meeting rather than a loving parent. As Adorno states, the family is constructed as a kind of protective organization built exclusively on the principle of give and take rather than a spontaneous form of living together. This may well reflect certain structural changes in the modern family. Adorno states that, while the notion of the neighbour may be a simple carryover from the olden days of the fortune teller who thinks in such terms, it fulfills at the same time the timely function of conjuring up a picture of village-like traditionalism. Combined with the aforementioned structural changes in the modern family, the astrological column appears to provide both means of dealing with societal changes in modernity and a kind of nostalgic pleasure in the village-like traditionalism, which provides a comforting sense of community in an increasingly atomized industrial society. Friends are one of the most frequently mentioned topics in the astrology column. Adorno explains one of the functions of the friends within the column. They suddenly appear and heap benefits upon the addressee, either by giving him sound advice leading to an increase of his income, or by forthright donations, or by appointments to influential jobs. This reflects one of the themes running throughout the column, that life's problems, adversity, struggles resolve themselves automatically. We can reflect on Adorno's earlier statement that life actually does not automatically take care of people. Despite the column's attempt to convince us that the contrary is true, the column does this by employing a kind of deus ex machina, a literary trope where in a narrative, entities exterior to the text suddenly appear and resolve the story. The promise that situations will be resolved not from the reader's own actions, but externally, emphasizes the overall dependent psychology imposed on the reader. Adorno sees friends in the column as taking on paternal or authority figure roles. He writes, reference to the friends again comes close to the identification with the aggressor. In fact, it may be said that frequently the friends are but rather thin cloaks for the higher-ups, just as the family is a screen for the wife. The rationality of business relations is transfigured into love relationships, in which the same ones one has to fear are those who mean one's best, and whom therefore one has to love, an obvious transference from the Oedipal situation. To consider why friends may take on a kind of authoritarian or father figure role within the column, we can consider Lacan's idea of the fraternity, meaning the bond between friends. The Lacanian psychoanalyst Duane Roussel has summarized Lacan's concept of the fraternity as a social bond organized not around the name of the father, but around the segregative principle from the world and the wow of the comrades, siblings, or peers. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud theorizes an ancient tribal state of humanity in which a primeval father tyrannized his sons. The brothers banded together and murdered the father so that they no longer had to live under his yoke. However, they internalized the guilt of this patricide, which developed into the superego, an internal sense of authority which regulates the drives of the id. Although the anthropological validity of this theory is questionable at best, it serves as a sociological explanation of Oedipalization, the stages one goes through in order to develop mental maturity. To return to the astrological column, the status of friends seemed to indicate an appeal derived from a failed Oedipalization. Adorno writes, the function of the friend in the implicit ideology of the column is related to significant changes in the pattern of authoritarianism, which no longer invests father figures with authority, but replaces them by collectivities. A couple years after writing The Stars Down to Earth, Adorno would publish the essay On the Problem of the Family, where he links the transference of paternal authority to the collective with how authority is becoming more and more abstract, but also more and more inhuman and inexorable. In this world where authority is more abstract, friends can play an authoritative role without appearing as threatening as a true father figure. The friend in the column is the messenger of society, fused with that of the higher up, who, inasmuch as he appeals to duty, is almost invariably a representative of superego demands. In order to contextualize and conclude the study, Adorno suggests that astrological beliefs are on the rise, although he concedes there is no empirical data to confirm this at the time. He also remarks on how lonely heart advertisements, columns in the newspapers where readers look for love, often mention astrology signs. In our own time, a parallel would be the way in which dating app profiles include astrological signs. But the importance of the study is not necessarily the insight it offers into astrology per se, but rather the insight into the willingness people have to be invested in astrology. Adorno says that astrology is a symptom of our society and therefore can indicate the psychological trends of our time. One of the psychological trends identified by Adorno and discussed throughout the essay is social and psychological dependence. Adorno says that the Los Angeles Times astrology column shows how dependency needs of the audience are presupposed, fostered, and exploited continuously. This dependence has always been present to some extent in society. As long as states have existed, whether feudal monarchies or liberal democracies, the path of people's lives have been governed by external sources, even if people conceived of themselves as self-sustaining monads, as Adorno says. But with the rise of the industrial society, a far cry from Adam Smith's market society of small businessmen, the demands of large corporations and government renders the dependence transparent. Astrology serves as a tool for people to mitigate the pain of this dependence, while paradoxically feeding it. Adorno also notes that followers of astrology do not seem quite to believe, but rather take an indulgent, semi-ironical attitude towards their own conviction, which nevertheless strengthens and justifies painful conditions. The idea of an ironical distance strengthening rather than challenging the status quo brings to mind Zizek's formulation of fetishistic disavowal. They know what they are doing, and nevertheless they are doing it. Adorno goes on. People even of supposedly normal mind are prepared to accept systems of delusion for the simple reason that it is too difficult to distinguish such systems from the equally inexorable and equally opaque one under which they actually have to live out their lives. It is as though in the face of a complex social system, that is, industrial society, people are more willing to accept a system equally as opaque, astrology, but which at least offers simple rules to follow, albeit with the reasoning for said rules obscured behind the grand magus of the column. Adorno also ties this willingness to follow astrology to the increasing fears and threats of war and conflict. He writes, "The sense of an underlying crisis has never disappeared since the First World War. The sense of threat is real enough, and some of its expressions, such as the A and H bombs, are about to outrun the wildest neurotic fears and destructive fantasies. Astrology takes care of this mood by translating it into a pseudo-rational form, thus somehow localizing free-floating anxieties in some definite symbolism. But it also gives some vague and diffused comfort by making the senseless appear as though it had some hidden and grandiose sense, while at the same time corroborating that this sense can neither be sought in the realm of the human, nor can properly be grasped by humans. Thus, astrology and superstition in general may prove to become more popular in times of societal crisis. Making the senseless appear as though it had some hidden and grandiose sense is reminiscent of conspiracy thinking, where increasingly chaotic events are rationalized with absurd references to superstitious notions, numerology, symbology, or prophecy. Adorno writes, "The cult of God has been replaced by the cult of facts. Just as the fatal entities of astrology, the stars, are themselves viewed as facts, things ruled by mechanical laws." Adorno also regards modern science to be promoting a kind of opaqueness, which for the average person mirrors the opaqueness of the reasoning behind the predictions in the horoscope. Adorno rejects the notion that the popularity of astrology is a result of the decline of erudition, and actually claims that erudition is more widespread than in past societies due to the spread of arts and sciences through the means of mass communications, that is, mass media. Rather than astrology being a symptom of a decline of intelligence and education, Adorno suggests it could be the result of a society where facts and information are prioritized over intellectual penetration and reflection. Astrology is, of course, rife with facts and information, and yet offers little to no opportunity for interpretation. Similarly, news media often focus on providing facts and information rather than the tools to interpret those facts and information. Although, of course, it is primarily the role of news media to gather and report facts rather than to provide the means to interpret them. Opinion columns are an attempt to fill this gap in interpretation. However, more often than not, they take the form of interpreting the facts on the behalf of the reader, rather than providing the necessary background or education for the reader to interpret the facts themselves. Consider how often inflation statistics or gross domestic product is reported on and referred to in news, and yet seldom do we receive an explanation of what these data actually are and how they are gathered and constructed. Adorno situates the astrological fad within the all-comprising pattern of culture industry, referring to the culture industry concept put forward by Adorno and Horkheimer in their collaborative book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, in 1947. For the sake of prudence, we cannot explicate on the concept of the culture industry here beyond a few remarks. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer draw comparisons between the giants of industry in America, for example the electric industry and the banks, and notes how the rigorous organization and systematization of traditional industry has infected art through the vector of the culture industry. Large film studios, record companies, and radio stations conform to the assembly line commodity production of General Motors and obey the logic of commodity exchange. Adorno and Horkheimer compare the domination of culture in the United States by market logic to the situation in Germany and in the world more generally in the 19th century. In Germany, many things were exempt from the market mechanism which had invaded the Western countries. The German educational system, universities, theatres with artistic standards, great orchestras and museums enjoyed protection. The political powers, state and municipalities, which had inherited such institutions from absolutism, had left them with a measure of the freedom from the forces of power which dominates the market, just as princes and feudal lords had done up to the 19th century. Newspapers in which the astrology column is situated are also an industrial commodity in this sense. Adorno somewhat summarizes his findings in this statement. Moreover, by strengthening the sense of fatality, dependence, and obedience, the astrology column paralyzes the will to change objective conditions in any respect and relegates all worries to a private plane, promising a cure-all by the very same compliance which prevents a change of conditions. It can easily be seen how well this suits the overall purpose of the prevailing ideology of today's culture industry, to reproduce the status quo within the mind of the people. So now that we have diagnosed all the pernicious dimensions which existed within astrology and the astrological horoscope, must we conclude that astrology should be dismissed as a purely ideological and harmful practice? That may be a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Astrology has taken many forms over the centuries, whether as a means to diagnose medical treatments for medieval doctors, a way to predict weather patterns in order to find the optimal time to plant crops, or as a source of personal insight, relationship, and career advice. In modern times, the latter is astrology's primary role, whereas the former two have been supplanted by meteorological and biomedical sciences. However, much in the way that party games can facilitate social bonding and personal insight, astrology may still have a role to play in providing us a certain social benefit. So here is a provisional list of possible ways that the pernicious elements of the astrological column may be alleviated. Number 1. Offer a way out of the quotidian and humdrum. Rather than sticking to everyday topics and the dichotomy of work and leisure, broach subjects which challenge the reader. Number 2. Disavow omniscience and embrace uncertainty. To shake the reader out of the notion that the magus is the subject supposed to know, a being who knows all and can be relied on blindly for guidance, acknowledge the inherent unpredictability and chaotic nature of life and society. Number 3. Reject commodification and therefore escape flattery. Self-acted astrology. The astrological columns deploy flattery and vague statements to compensate for the fact they must be relevant to many readers at once. A one-to-one astrological reading could circumvent this. Number 4. Confront and dereify external forces. Instead of naturalizing the forces which dominate our lives, recognize that the many paths our lives may take are somewhat determined by political and economic decisions. Of course, these measures would likely divest astrology of the libidinal appeal which renders it so popular in contemporary times, but we can at least outline that the problem with astrology is not necessarily astrology itself, but the pathologies which it absorbs and conducts while within our industrial society. By reflecting on the ways in which astrology, or any cultural phenomena for that matter, is permeated with conservative notions, we may be able to forge a path towards different ways of thinking and living.